Good afternoon. My name is Judy Margles. I am the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. I'm joined today by our partner organizations, the Never Again Coalition and the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Project at PSU. You're going to meet Amanda Byron Singer shortly. And we all want to welcome you to today's program, The Difference Between Transformative and Performative Accounting Post-Holocaust. I'm really delighted to welcome our panelists. I mentioned Amanda Byron Singer. I also want to welcome Tamara Meyer and Robbie Schaefer. At the museum, our mission is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. All of our virtual programming, including today's event and recordings of past events, are offered without charge. We're always grateful for any donation you might be able to make to support our work or the work of our partner organizations. You'll be able to find information about upcoming programming, membership opportunities, or donating on our website. I also want to put a little plug in. This Sunday, February 20th, is the museum's annual fundraising gala. It's called Pull Up a Chair. It's a virtual program, no charge to register. And I mention it because our guest speaker is CNN's Jake Tapper. We'll have a link to register in the chat. You're welcome to join us and hear what he has to say. Starts at 5:30. It's a very short program, so the remarks will be over around 6 p.m. I hope you've all had a chance to see the film Final Account. I understand that it is available on Netflix if anyone is logging in today, but they actually haven't been able to see it. And of course, this is a film which portrays the last living generation of people, SS members, civilians who participated in Hitler's Third Reich. The reckoning with their memories, perceptions, and appraisal of their culpability for me was chilling. And it raised so many questions in the film. There's so many questions that I think we'll be able to get into today. Questions about authority, compliance, complicity, and ultimately responsibility. Our three panelists spent the week of Kristallnacht last November in Goerlitz, Germany, commemorating Jewish Remembrance Week. I'm grateful that they are here today to share their experiences. I know they're really going to help us understand the nature of apology, and especially in terms of what constitutes a final apology or the final accounting in the aftermath of atrocity. As always, you'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We do welcome your questions. We're going to leave time for what we hope will be a robust Q&A with all of you. So it's my great pleasure to turn the program over to Amanda Byron Singer, who's a social justice educator with more than 30 years experience working with diverse communities to heal trauma and transform conflict. Dr. Singer is an associate professor in conflict resolution at Portland State University, where she directs the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program, coordinates the Holocaust and Genocide Atrocity Prevention Graduate Certificate. Amanda, the program is yours, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Judy, and thanks to everyone for being here today for this important presentation. And thank you also for enduring the film, which was difficult to watch for those of you who had a chance to watch it. And as much as Judy might hope that we're going to answer all of the questions around apology, I hope more that we elicit further questions as opposed to answering any of them particularly, because I think that there's a lot of open questions about how to go about the final account. What does accountability mean in these situations? Before we get started, however, I just want to introduce our panelists, Tamara Meyer and Robbie Schaefer. So excited to have them here. All three of us are children of Holocaust survivors, and that is how we know each other, and is definitely the connection that brought us together and inspires our continued work together. I'll tell you a little bit about them. Tamara I met 15 years ago in Berlin, Germany, in a dialogue between second-generation survivors and children of perpetrators of the Holocaust. And she does beautiful work working around conflict resolution and bringing in the voices of current neo-Nazis who have left their hateful pasts in order to forge greater understanding. So it's such a delight to have her here and be part of this conversation. Robbie Schaefer is my new best friend, and he is a musician and a rabbi in training. I'll let that cat out of the bag right away. And he has written a musical about the stories of Holocaust survivors and their children that is now being made into a film. And you can read more about both of their bios on the website, because they both bring tremendous backgrounds to this conversation. So that's a very brief introduction. And I see in the chat that many of you who were with us in Goerlitz are participating here as audience members. And I'm so excited to see all of your names pop up. So hello again. Before we get started in the questions that Robbie and Tamara and I have discussed in our preliminary conversations for this panel, I just want to invite Tamara first and Robbie second to reflect a little bit on Final Account. If there's any introductory remarks that you want to make, that in my very brief introduction, obviously I skipped a lot of details, or if you'd like to reflect on the film itself. So Tamara, would you start us off?
Well, I have to say the film was very difficult to watch, and it was also interesting, illuminating, very challenging. And it also brought me back to when you and I met through the organization Eins by Eins, One by One. I see that Dr. Martina Emma, who is one of the founders of One by One from Berlin, Germany, is with us today. It brought me back to that dialogue group where I was in a circle with two former Nazis, with a Holocaust survivor who, by the strangest coincidence, was one of my mother's best friends from Berlin from back in the 30s, and with a host of other descendants of former Nazis and survivors. And it kind of gave me solace to keep touching back to that experience of our dialogue group while I was watching this, because I found it somewhat painful to watch the film. I think what I had the greatest difficulty with was the lack of accountability. I really only heard one gentleman, Verk, say, "I'm ashamed, and I did the wrong thing." I didn't hear. I think I was longing to hear someone say, "I'm sorry," and I didn't hear that. In fact, I also heard, at least one of the people who was interviewed in this film. Basically, this film is a compilation of interviews of former Nazis from Germany, and one of those interviewed actually said, "I have nothing to be ashamed of," and he was a former SS officer. So I will start with that.
Thank you so much. Ravi, would you like to make some opening comments?
Sure. Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, I mean, obviously that was, of course, I think for all of us, a difficult film to watch and a really important one. And I think what struck me more than anything is that we're almost never the bad guy in our own story. Mm-hmm. And at any level of human interaction, that is one of the hardest things for human beings to do, is to see themselves wholly, with a WH, to see themselves as whole people and to reckon with that. I find that to be a lifelong practice. And of course, when the stakes are heightened to something like this, when we're talking about oppression, or in this case, genocide, To take a long, hard look at yourself in a very clear way is, well, I don't know what that takes in a moment like that. And yet that's what I saw over and over and over again, the inability or the unwillingness to do some really, really hard seeing. And if it sounds like I'm letting some of those people in the film off the hook, I hope it doesn't, because that doesn't mean that they're off the hook. But that's what I saw over and over again, people that are just either unable or unwilling to reckon with their own selves.
Thank you. So the title of this presentation asks us to think about the difference between transformative and performative accounting. What does accountability look like when it has that authenticity that really does transform the situation versus just being a performance to try and cover up the tracks of wrongdoing. What's interesting in the story, in the film Final Account, is that I wonder if either of those have been accomplished. As Tamara suggests, the people who were interviewed, very few of them seem to even perform remorse, let alone really be remorseful. And it brings up some really interesting questions around what it is that we need, and Robbie, as you mentioned, what it is that is possible in situations where we're trying to grapple in the aftermath of wrongdoing. And so some of the questions that I thought we might look at today are, what does accountability look like? What would we've talked, even before today's panel, we talked a little bit about forgiveness, and one of the most profound aspects of the dialogue group in which Tamara and I met 15 years ago was the fact that that was a word that we overtly did not address in the course of the dialogue process. It wasn't a process that invited forgiveness or expected forgiveness or even had a conversation about forgiveness. But the question about accountability is a different question. And so what does accountability look like? What might we aspire toward in this regard? Either of you have any thoughts?
I had an experience maybe about 10 years ago, something like that. And I think when we think about accountability, I think we often think of a lot of words, at least I do. Accountability seems to have to do with language, right? And am I saying the right things, that even whether I feel them authentically or not, am I saying the things that people need to hear? And I had this experience about 10 years ago. I was in Paris, and I was at a friend's house in the evening, and she had a few friends over, and there was one woman there named Valerie, and we started talking. And I think I was, yeah, anyway, I remember somehow our talk got around to me mentioning that my father had been a Holocaust survivor. And she teared up, and she put her hand on my hand and said, "I'm so sorry." And I said, "Oh, no, it's okay." And she said, "No, my family's from Germany. I live here in France, but my family is from Germany." And I realized, and this is the only time this has happened in my life, that she wasn't saying she's sorry for my father. She was apologizing. And she's a second generation like I am. We didn't say a whole lot more, but everything about her energy and about how she looked in that moment was authentic.
Mm.
And I didn't need more words from her. It felt like accountability.
Right.
So maybe that's one way it looks. I don't know.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Tamara, what does accountability mean to you? Yeah.
You know, when you mentioned, you know, the topic here, you know, what my mind was, what I was brought to is the Jewish tradition of asking forgiveness and making someone whole. You know, in our Jewish tradition, we can't ask God for forgiveness. We have to go to that person who we've wronged, and we have to make them whole and ask how we can do that. And that's something that I've gotten involved with somewhat to some degree here with regard to restorative justice. And, you know, when you think about restorative justice writ large, I think, you know, what Robbie just spoke about, you know, although that apology can't make, you know, can't undo what was done, there's something about it that's the sincerity, the accountability that in some way made you whole. And you know, I've heard this now from other second generation people like ourselves who have been you know, who've met descendants from the other side, from the perpetrator side, and who've had these kinds of conversations. That's really what I was looking for in our dialogue groups, I think. I was so moved to go to Berlin for that dialogue group when I first heard that descendants of the Holocaust from both sides would be getting together. And there was something so transformative for me for to bearing witness to other people's narratives, whether they be from the perpetrator or the victim side, the Holocaust survivor or the Nazi side. It's always, the lingua franca has kind of changed back and forth a bit. But there is something for me that was extraordinarily transformative. And although, as you say, we didn't speak about forgiveness, and I don't quite get forgiveness. I felt transformed by that experience. And I have continued to, as I've come to work with former white supremacists in this country. I work with an organization that helps people leave white supremacy. It's meant a lot to me to work with others who have had the courage to leave hate groups. And that for me has also given me such hope. I think what I'm looking for, I think when you look at the Holocaust writ large, at least from my perspective, there's a hopelessness about it, because I can't see how it was possible for this to happen, and that my relatives, you know, suffered in this, at this time in history. Both of my parents are Holocaust survivors from Germany. It's just almost too much to contemplate all of it. And I think what I look for is hope. I'm looking for reasons to have hope. And sometimes it's really hard to find those reasons and those chances to feel hope. And I think I have felt them the most when I've had a chance to bring together, or to be a part of a gathering of people with different opinions, different backgrounds, and find common ground.
Great. Thank you. Those are great examples. And just a real quick comment, if you have questions, we'll be addressing questions that are posted into the Q&A. If you've been posting your questions into the chat, you may want to retype them into Q&A so we can find them with more ease. We will be answering questions in just a moment. So thank you, Robbie and Tamara, for your answers to those questions, or your considerations of those questions. Again, we're not specializing in answers here. We're trying to just understand more about the nature of accountability and what's possible or what we might hope for. Now, our most recent connection and many of our participants here at this webinar have watched the presentation that I gave from Goerlitz in November when we were all there together. And thinking about this opportunity for transformative versus performative accountability, I wanted to invite some reflections on the nature of that experience for helping us to feel, again, as three children of Holocaust survivors. How did we feel in the ceremonies and opportunities for remembrance? How did that restore us? Did we experience any of that accountability that perhaps we were looking for, or that we've been describing? How did that play out in the week that we spent in Goerlitz? Was that an example of German accountability? If so, how did it hit us?
Well, I think I'll start by saying that I was moved to go to Germany as a result of a young woman who lives in Goerlitz, Lauren Leiterman, reaching out to me and many, many other descendants throughout the world, and coming up with a week of events, which I helped with in Goerlitz, to celebrate the destroyed community of Goerlitz, Germany, where my mom and aunt and grandparents and many other relatives are from. And I would say that one of the most powerful moments for me was a gathering just outside my family's business in Goerlitz. We had, my great-grandfather had one of the first department stores in Germany. My grandfather inherited it. It was then stolen. But that building still stands. And in fact, it's owned by two wonderful young men who have restored the name of our store to my grandfather's original name, Kaufhaus-Totschek. And we were there to install Stolpersteine, which are memorial stones that have been placed in the last location where Jews either worked or lived before they were rounded up, before they were arrested, before they had to flee as a result of the Nazi persecution. So we laid 4 Stolpersteine from my mom, my aunt, my grandparents outside this beautiful building in Goerlitz, and it was very moving. And I was very much affected by that. I want to say something also about this city. I had very bittersweet feelings coming to Goerlitz, for I think probably for rather obvious reasons. I mean, this is where in 1942, the last Jews in this city were rounded up and murdered. There have been no Jews living there since 1942 until Lauren Leiterman and her husband, Mark, moved there a few years ago. He's Jewish, she's not. I was really affected by the events that took place on what we call Kristallnacht in the United States. They call it's the Night of Broken Glass in Germany. And these were the nights of November 8th and 9th when synagogues throughout Germany were destroyed. Jewish men were arrested. Many were murdered. My grandfather was arrested and taken to Dachau on that night in 1938. And since 1973, the city of Goerlitz has gotten together. I saw hundreds and hundreds of, at least a couple of hundred people gather in a church for a presentation, after which all the townspeople, including all of us, walked with lit candles to the synagogue. And there was a jazz sax player and the mayor, town officials, and we had an event and kind of a ceremony outside of the synagogue. One of the only, by the way, that withstood Kristallnacht. It was not destroyed on Kristallnacht. They think because one of the Nazi commandant's houses was right next to it, and he didn't want his house to burn down. So it still stands and it's been refurbished. It's quite beautiful. So I was very touched by that. I would say that these are, the positive feelings I have, with regard to some of the events that we had, and there's so many, this past November when we were all together in Goerlitz. And I was so honored to have the two of you come, by the way.
It was an honor to be there. I want to give Robbie a chance to answer that question too. And also we do have questions piling up in the Q&A. Thank you to all the participants. So I'll turn to those shortly, but I want to give Robbie a chance to answer that question.
Yeah, I won't give too much of an answer. I don't have the personal connection to Goerlitz that Tamara has. But I will say that I had this wash of a mixture of feelings the entire time I was there. Some of which were incredibly moving. Just the fact that we were all there together, just the fact of that. The fact that I got to sing in this synagogue, which somehow survived through all those decades and the war. And it felt like a little bit of a reconsecration, a little bit. But also that, for instance, the synagogue, which has been beautifully restored, as I saw, especially in the back rooms and stuff, there were a lot of Jewish artifacts under glass, almost like museum pieces. And I know the three of us have talked about this, and it's a popular book right now, and maybe even a controversial one, I don't know, but People Love Dead Jews, which came out in the last few months, talking about I had read it just before this trip, and seeing that aspect of things as well, that there are good intentions and great intentions in the money and the energy that's put into restore a synagogue such as that, but it's also easier to do that, and I say that outside the Holocaust, in any situation, it's easier to pay homage to something like that, to a people, than it is to actually be with them and all the messiness that is. And so what's harder is to have a large Jewish community that has a working synagogue, right? That's a harder thing to reckon with, I suppose. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, that opens up another wonderful conversation that speaks very much to the performative versus transformative, and just to nod in the direction of that book, in this regard of performative versus transformative, she speaks to, I can't think of her name right now. Does anyone remember her name?
Anna Horn.
Thank you. Speaks to the fact that it's much easier to pity the Jews that have died than it is to truly be accountable for those actions and hold people accountable for those actions, because that's where it gets messy, is to recognize that we don't just need compassionate pity toward those who suffered. We need to understand the mechanisms that have created opportunities for the suffering to happen, not just once, but throughout time. And that gets to some of the questions that have been shared in the Q&A, such as, like, can an entire generation or two of Germans demonstrate accountability? Or really, is that something that can only happen, as Robbie explained, in that one-on-one dialogue, or as Tamara described, in the one-by-one, eins by eins dialogue process where we met in Berlin? And similarly, there's another question that says, while accountability is certainly a desired goal, do we hold the children and grandchildren responsible to be accountable for the actions of their parents and grandparents? Who holds the burden of guilt for the Holocaust, and how do we reconcile that, as Final Account has demonstrated in our own efforts in the United States to preserve the stories and the testimonies of survivors? That generation is dying. And so what are we left with? What are we holding? And what opportunities are there for transformation? True transformation, or deeper accountability, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to one by one. It does come down to, I think it's hard to be accountable writ large. I think in some ways, Germany has really made a lot of effort to do that, more so than many other countries. I've been very impressed with Angela Merkel's work. I've been very impressed with what Germany has done post-World War II to take accountability, writ large. But then I've also been touched by individuals. For example, in Goerlitz, a young German official, Daniel Breutmann, worked very hard to make sure these Stolpersteine, these memorial blocks would be installed. And we really became very close friends, as a result of this, these programs. I think I think it comes down to people really finding common ground. I keep finding that. I mean, I agree with so much of what you said, Robbie. I mean, I also had very mixed feelings while we were in Goerlitz. It wasn't all a rosy picture for me. It was very challenging. Some of the experiences, as you both know, were very challenging for me. But there was something quite wonderful about it also, that there, I'm remembering one evening when we walked past the store, my family's department store, and the Stolperstein had been laid, and there were candles that had been, Lauren had prepared these beautiful wreaths and candles. And I noticed that someone had placed an extra candle there, and that the candles were lit. And I thought, somebody in this city is lighting these candles. And it was such a small gesture, but it was very touching for me, and very, again, I'm looking for hope. Those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Robbie.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tamara. I think when you say you're looking for hope, that really can only come one person at a time. And yes, countries and governments are still responsible for answering some of these questions, right, that get asked of us historically. And as you've said, Germany as a country has gone to extraordinary lengths, really, to address the legacy of the Holocaust, I guess, largely writ, as you said, Amanda, but true change doesn't actually happen that way. True change happens person by person. And I don't know that guilt really is a productive or a constructive aspect of any of this. And so I think one of the questioners was asking about do we visit the guilt of the fathers, right, on the children? And this is what was so moving to me about the exchange I talked about in Paris, where Valerie, it wasn't really a question of whether her family in particular had been Nazis. I actually got the sense they had not been. And it wasn't a question, certainly, of whether she herself was guilty, but something had been carried forward to her generation. She was taking responsibility for that. And I found that to be incredibly brave and incredibly beautiful. We were not in some setting where we were supposed to have some sort of interaction with each other. She didn't have to say a thing. And yet she was incredibly vulnerable, and it was just this one-on-one. And it wasn't, I don't think, because she felt guilty. She just felt sorry.
Right. Well, Martin just put a beautiful story of his experience and one by one in the Q&A, a similar thing where he told his story at the one by one dialogue group, and one of the children of perpetrators wept, and there were no words exchanged, just the sharing of that space, and demonstrating the transformative potential of that one by one exchange. One of the other themes that's coming up both in the chat and the Q&A is, Martina is so sweet. Every time we are with her in Germany, she weeps and says, I want you to be living here forever, not just visiting. This is your ancestral home. I want you here as part of the fabric of this society. And one of the questions in the chat speaks to the nature of the synagogue being restored, but the Jewish community not being restored, right? And how it's having Jewish community back in Germany that feels restorative. That's where maybe a sense of restoration for Germans, or Martina can be our test case here, would be to have Jews returned to their ancestral home, and to have Jewish community alive and well in Germany. And I know that also in Goerlitz was expressed as one of the desires to repopulate that synagogue, not just to have it restored, but to have it resurrected as a dynamic hub of Judaism, not just a relic of history. And perhaps that is somewhere we can look to for hope, is imagining what that could look like in terms of potential changes in the future. Not that there aren't Jewish communities that exist in Germany, but certainly the situation in Goerlitz was the one that we were experiencing. Any thoughts on that that warm welcome from Martina and from this questioner in the Q&A, who speak to the need for that Jewish community to be revived? Or even actually, I mean, for me, I think about just that warmth of that invitation, in a sense, restores my own brokenness in this story, just, a sense of hope and a sense of warmth and welcome in a place where there was neither in the history of my mother.
Yeah, I totally agree, Amanda. It's that you hit on it. It's exactly it, is that even just the gesture of, and I know it's not, certainly in Martina's case, it is certainly not just a gesture, but even a gesture of it's like it's this attempt to reach across something that was broken, a chasm that was created between two peoples, even people in a new generation that didn't personally experience this or didn't personally know anybody who was a perpetrator. There's still this chasm that gets created, and the reach across is the point, right? I really think you've hit on that. Really resonates with me what you said.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I've gone to Goerlitz, there's a part of me, I do feel, in a certain sense, this is my ancestral home, or at least half of it. My father's from Mannheim, my mom is from Goerlitz, and then Berlin. And I feel so comfortable in Germany in a certain way. I just, the language, the smells, this is what I grew up with. I grew up in this German culture, in this country. My parents came here and they brought, of course, their experiences and their culture with them. And that was kind of the fertile soil from which I grew. Goerlitz is so tricky for me. It's I love that city. It is one of the most beautiful cities I've ever been to. It rivals Prague. I studied in Prague, but I'm also very aware of problems there. I'm also very aware that it's part of the East. I'm also very aware that 40% of the population voted AfD, which is the far right-wing Nazi party, neo-Nazi party, sorry. I feel in some ways more comfortable in Berlin. I feel like I could live there in a heartbeat. But I am very much drawn to that city of Goerlitz. It is just, there's a part of me that feels like it's home. And then there's a part of me that wants to run away. So it's just, it's so, there's a lack of clarity for me about how, about that place for me. And yet, Martina, I thank you so much. I feel your love, and there's a part of me that would love to have a home in Germany. Thank you.
So this complexity of holding these personal transformations with these larger questions of forgiveness and the lack of capacity for forgiveness, like how it's not our place to forgive those who are responsible for the harms that were perpetrated against our ancestors, is one that I don't know that we're going to answer, but one that we continue to grapple with, and that definitely shapes the nature of our yearning for accountability, or our upset maybe in the lack of accountability that we experience in a film like Final Account. It also, I think, feeds the concern that many people have expressed in the Q&A around what do we do with these neo-Nazi movements that are on the rise in Eastern Germany in particular, but throughout Europe, really. It's not unique to Eastern Germany and Poland and other places where there are these very strong anti-immigrant sentiments and these very neo-Nazi and white supremacist values. In the film Final Account, there was a scene at the end of the movie with young people who were espousing the ideas of Nazism and arguing with the SS elder who was talking about his shame and regret. What are some of the, Tamara, you mentioned working with people to help them leave the hate, organized hate movements, and someone had asked for the name of the organization that you work with. But what do we see as the opportunities to try and infuse some hope in our listenership here around what do we do now? How do, the phrase never again, I think, doesn't ring as true as any of us would like for it to ring. So education is key. This is something that, we've shown over time, but how do we bring it? How do we create the kind of protections and invitations into transformation that perhaps, Tamara, you're involved in, and that we might like to foster?
Well, first of all, the organization that I was referring to is Parents for Peace. And I can put it in the chat, or I'll send it to Amber, and who organized this, and it can go out to everyone. But I don't have a set answer. I think, I'm aware of so much divisiveness. We all are in this country and elsewhere right now, and it's not easy. It's just not easy. It's not as easy as just searching out someone who's different from you and having a conversation. In a way it is that easy, and in a way it's not, because I think people have become so divided. One thing I can recommend is to look for organizations like Parents for Peace and some of the other organizations that are around in this country and elsewhere that do bring people together in a safe and structured environment, such as one by one, eins by eins in Berlin. Those of you who have a Holocaust background who might be interested, we can also put some information about that organization. I think also seeking out people who, who are like-minded, and seeing if together we can work together to make a difference. It's a lot easier to work together with other people than just on your own. I don't know that that's such a great answer, but that's what I've got right now.
Thank you. Robbie, do you have something?
Not really. It's, this will always be a question, right? How do you combat anti-Semitism or racism or the only answer that comes to me personally in the last year or so is to live more Jewishly. And there are plenty of more, not that that's not an active thing, it is very much so, but there are plenty of organizations and educational opportunities that you can lend your energy, your money to, and all of these kinds of things. And those are also very important. But I also think combined with that, especially in the United States, where it's Jews in the United States have found it very easy to assimilate and not be very outwardly Jewish. That's not true for all Jews in the United States, but it certainly was true for me for a good part of my life, most of my life. I never hid my Jewishness, but I also, let's just say I was deft in the way that I could sort of weave through life as a Jew, but also as part of everyone around me. And I think to live proudly, but also very deliberately as a Jew. Judaism asks us to live by our actions, not by our beliefs. Our actions come first. And it sets pretty high demands on those actions. It asks us to be usually way better, way more mindful, way more fierce in our love than we tend to want to be a lot of the time. And I think showing up like that over and over and over again is a good thing for other people to see.
Thank you. Thanks, Robbie.
That's beautiful, Robbie.
So
Thank you.
beautiful. Yeah. So thank you both for sharing so much. There's a bunch of other questions that we might run through a little bit in the Q&A. There was one question about how people feel about the Stolpersteine and whether that is more of a performative or transformative accounting for what happened. If it's more like the synagogue that's been refurbished but not reused, or if it has more significance. I wonder if anyone has thoughts about that.
I feel very strongly about the Stolpersteine. The Stolpersteine project, it's the largest memorial in the world. And it was started by, it is an artist, Günter Demmek's project that was started in 1997. And my mother's was the 80,000th Stolpersteine that has been installed. And for me personally, I can't say that it is an accounting. I do feel that it's very meaningful because I know that these Stolpersteine will remain. They are set into the ground. They are cared for by the community, not the Jewish community. There really isn't any Jewish community to speak of in Goerlitz, but usually members of the community take charge of making sure Stolpersteine are cared for and cleaned and so forth. And this, to me, this act of caring for them once they've been installed, I think is very meaningful. I'm not going to give a name to it, whether it's transformative, performative, but it's meaningful to me as someone who now has been involved in having Stolpersteine installed for my family.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I can speak to having my first trip to Germany was in Berlin, and seeing the Stolpersteine in Berlin was very, very profound for me, because it was a subtle, enduring, and poignant reminder of the lives that had been destroyed. And they were everywhere, you know, or at least in particular neighborhoods that had been predominantly Jewish. And that was a very, very powerful memorial to me. There's so many questions, I'm not quite sure how to weave them all in, but I think that a lot of them that are remaining pertain to, you know, what do we do about, what do we do? What do we do? That's the question that I think all of us were left with at the end of Final Account, when we see the lack of transformation that has occurred in these testimonials, these stories from former Nazis. And I love Robbie's personal explanation of what can be done, and would like to echo the fact that these connections and this willingness to explore the emotion, these obviously, to address one of the questions, this doesn't restore the economic devastation and the political horrors and the government accountability and responsibility that endure in this atrocity as well as in others, but it gives some of the restoration and some of the transformation that we as inheritors of these stories need to feel restored, to feel whole, even if we continue to carry these stories of harm. And there's also reference in the Q&A to the responsibility that we as Americans hold to the atrocities that have occurred on this soil. And I know for myself that a lot of my work is informed by dealing with the harms where we're planted. I mean, if I have inherited Holocaust trauma, it doesn't mean I have to go to Germany in order to work on that. I can work on that in Indigenous communities and African-American communities where I live, because the nature of healing these harms is something that is common. Not to say that any of it is going to lead to resolution. Certainly none of it erases those harms. And as we move away from the notion of forgiveness, but see the transformative potential of apology, we see that there's still benefit to gain from that attentiveness to addressing human suffering wherever we find it. And again, I just harken back to Robbie's beautiful description of what that looks like, to soften the hearts of and restore some sense of dignity, which is the word that I continue to lift up in the face of this. Is how do we restore the dignity of those who've been humiliated? How do we infuse dignity in those who have been historically oppressed? That is the task that feels the most transformative, even if it doesn't address the complexity of political harm and economic devastation. I'm just scrolling through more questions here. I don't know if Tamara and Robbie want to add anything or share.
I'd love to just respond to something you said, which was it was really so beautiful, Amanda. And yeah, talking about dignity, and you taught me a new word in Germany, redignification. And I hadn't thought of it. It's really so spot on. And I think when you're talking about the redignification of a place, of a people, of a community, we're talking about being seen and being heard, first and foremost. And And it's funny because that's not where our brains tend to go when we think of activism, when we think of combating racism, combating anti-Semitism, being seen and being heard. So it is our job then also to see and to hear as much as possible, as openly as possible, especially when the things we see and hear may not be things that we like, and maybe things that actually challenge us or make us incredibly uncomfortable. So yeah, anyway, just thank you for saying that. And I think there's as Jews, again, we are commanded every year to remind ourselves that we were once strangers in a strange land, and that we were once slaves in Egypt. And so that really, why do we do that every year? It's not just to tell our own story, although that's part of it, but the other part of it is to remind ourselves again and again that yes, we still are the slave in Egypt. We still are the stranger in the strange land. We understand what that feels like, and it's our responsibility to reach out to other communities, indigenous communities, in the United States, of course, the African American community, and to be the one seeing and hearing.
So well said. So well said. I think that is something that we've been given as Jews in this country, the opportunity to make a difference for others who are suffering persecution or have suffered persecution. You know, I felt that very strongly, and I was given that mantle kind of from my parents that, you know, we've survived, and our job now is to do what we can to make the world a better place. By the way, I saw a comment, a woman mentioning that she had tried to seek, that she had sought German citizenship. I was the first second generation American to receive German citizenship as part of Holocaust reparations. And this was back in 1997. And the German government, for me, it was very, very meaningful to receive this German citizenship. It did, you know, it was a part, I won't say that it made me whole, but there was some part of it that made a kind of this did make a kind of reparation to me. It did give me a sense of wholeness, a sense of reparation, to know that now I also claim this country again. It was taken from my parents in 1936. All Jews lost their citizenship, and I have it back. Very meaningful. And yes, I believe that it still stands that you can still seek German citizenship if your parents were stripped of theirs in 1936.
Thank you, Tamara. I think those are beautiful, concrete examples of what can be done, and potentially what mechanisms there are for that restoration of a sense of belonging, which is one of the key components of dignity. And Robbie, Judy and I were just talking yesterday about being seen, which is one of the core elements of Timothy Snyder's work on tyranny. You know, the importance of being seen. So that is also an important takeaway for what to do in this situation. So again, we're not answering any of these larger questions of what a final account looks like, but hopefully our conversation has given you an invitation into thinking, you, our audience, an invitation into thinking more deeply about what's needed, what's possible, and what's hopeful about creating change and making a difference. We're at our appointed hour here, and I want to thank the panelists, and I want to invite Judy back to.
It's coming. There I am.
Hi.
Hi. Well, you were right. You did raise more questions than you answered, but I just want to thank you. This was one of the most thoughtful and important conversations. You've given us all a lot to think deeply about, and it's good. So thank you for complicating the situation, but really bringing it up to the present as well. So thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, audience, for, as always, being such a great audience. Your questions were especially stellar today. So look forward to seeing you at our next program. Thank you, everyone. Go out and do good work. Bye-bye.
Thank you.